Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm very happy to join you this morning as we look at the GHS survey results and numbers and to pray and think about our nation. We have been looking at the percentage of Christians in Singapore, but I have some other numbers to show you. And this is the number of churches in Singapore. It's a different way of looking at how Christianity is growing in our nation. So as you can see from this chart here, the number of churches in Singapore has grown fairly steadily over the years, right? So all the way from early on, about 100 churches or so in 1970s to about 800 or so churches today. So that's a fairly substantial growth. Now, what is most revealing is when you break down this chart into the number of churches being planted per decade over all these years. And what you find is that we have been fairly steady in the planting of churches until about the 2010s. Now remember, these are the number of churches, right? These are not the number of Christians. But I do think that the number of churches and the rate of planting of churches do reflect on the growth of Christianity in the nation. At 2010, something happened. There was a precipitous drop in the number of churches being planted, and there are many reasons we can think about that. But if that is true, this downturn and decline of Christianity in Singapore is not something that only happened in 2025, 2026. This is something that had begun over a decade ago, and we are only feeling it now. And this tells us that the growth issues are multi-generational. It's more than the tenure of one average pastor. So if you're a pastor, you might be a pastor for 5 years, 10 years. This is longer than your tenure. It takes more than one generation of pastors to solve this problem. So we have to start thinking beyond our own lifetime as a pastor, right? We have to think about who we are handing the baton over and to make sure and empower that person to do as well as they can. The second thing that I looked at was to compare this growth, rate of growth of churches to the population numbers. So when we overlay the rate of population growth, that's the number of new people in Singapore every year, you find a fairly interesting correlation here. I understand correlation is not the same as causation, but it might be telling that the number of churches being planted in Singapore has something to do with the number of new Singaporeans in Singapore every year. So I think it is important for us to consider this, that there are some natural reasons for the growth and decline of churches that are not tied to how we are performing individually, right? So we don't have to beat ourselves up over it. There are some natural reasons for why a church may grow or even decline in a nation. What is interesting is over here in 1970s and 1980s, and I've marked this out in the red, we can see that actually the number of churches were growing faster than the population was growing, right? On average at the rate. And that is probably due to what was called the charismatic renewal. It is possible for us to outperform the growth of national population. But what does it take, right? That's the question I'm asking. So I look a bit deeper. I look at the Anglican churches, and that's the chart showing the number of Anglican churches that have been planted over the years. Usually, about 2 or 3 a year, averaging about 4. But in 1970, all of a sudden, we have 9 churches being planted in that one decade alone. So I thought I'd take a look at it, and what I found was that of the 9 churches that were being planted, 5 of them were planted by just one person, Pastor James Wong, or Canon James Wong, as many of you know him. This one person was a prolific church planter. He was out there, he was planting churches, he was innovating, he was doing new things. And that encourages me because, it doesn't take many people to turn the tide. It doesn't take a lot of people to actually move that needle. But it does take a very interesting person. What kind of person does it take? What is required of us? There was a Soviet researcher in 1959 by the name of Dmitry Belyaev. And he studied foxes, silver foxes. And he was trying this experiment where he would breed foxes that were tame. Right? So they measured the distance a fox will allow you to approach it without being aggressive, without reacting in fear. And if they found a fox that was, tamer, they will breed that particular fox. And they found that over a period of 5 to 10 years, what happened was that the foxes began to exhibit biological traits and features that were very interesting. For instance, the ears of the fox will start to have floppy ears, right? And they begin to have dots on their body and markings on their body. Foxes don't normally have this. They're wild animals, right? And they will even wag their tails. And when they wanted food from you, they will whimper. So it was basically, the foxes were becoming like domesticated dogs, pet dogs. I thought about this and I thought, this is really interesting. You know, just by selecting for a particular behavior, the whole biology of the animals changed. And I'm wondering about what we've been selecting for in Christians in Singapore, and whether we have now produced a generation of Christians that are perhaps domesticated and missing the edge required to take on the challenges that are facing us. So today we are concerned about many things. We're concerned about mental health, we're concerned about wanting to have a balanced life, and many things that are important to us. But perhaps in so doing, we have selected ourselves into a kind of domesticated Christianity that is unable to take on the challenges that before. We have lost the edge. I want to close by sharing from 1 Samuel chapter 13. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, Israel found itself at war with the Philistines. Who else, right? Always that same group. And in this particular war, it was really interesting because the Israelites found that they had completely lost their edge. Literally, that the whole army did not have swords or spears. Usually, when they had they go to war, they would use their farming implements, right? So they would take their sickle, the goad, or the axe, or whatever you have, and they go to war with it. But the problem is that there were no blacksmiths in this whole nation. Whenever they need to sharpen their tools, they actually had to go to the Philistine blacksmith, pay them money to sharpen their tools. But now they're going to war. How's this going to work? Could you, by the way, sharpen my axe for me? I'm going to need it next week when, I was fighting you guys, right? That is absurd. But that's exactly what happened. So in 1 Samuel chapter 14, on the day of battle, this is exactly what happened. Saul and 600 men had no weapons. But if you read the text really carefully in 1 Samuel chapter 13, they did have two swords. One sword was in the hand of Saul, and one sword was in the hand of Jonathan. On that day, Saul was seated with 600 of his fighting men, without swords, without weapons. They were in a place called Gibeah, sitting under a pomegranate tree. I think they were probably discussing, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? One sword was with them. But where was the other sword? Well, the other sword was with Jonathan. Jonathan was not a domesticated fox. He was over in the Philistine camp with his armor bearer. The two of them decided that, let's go. We're going to do this thing, right? So the two of them, with the one sword that's probably not sharpened, went up against the garrison of the Philippines. And this is what Jonathan said to his armor bearer. He said to his armor bearer, he said, let's go. It may be that the Lord will go with us, that the Lord will give us victory, right? It may be, we're not sure about this, but you know what? Let's do it anyway. Let's give it all we've got. Because nothing stops the Lord from saving by many or by few. This is a great challenge before us. God can save by many or by few. But the few would have to be like Jonathan, not a domesticated fox, not people who have lost their edge. I think it's time for us to ask ourselves, have we lost our edge? If so, how can we recover that edge?